Hi, everybody. I'd love to introduce Pete Barbrook-Johnson from Oxford University, and he's been modeling the societal transition to a cleaner energy future. Yeah, welcome, Pete.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for having me. So Greg asked me to talk a bit about some of the work we've been doing at INET and at Oxford. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and give you a kind of broad overview of some of the methods we've been using to model the energy transition. And INET, you see there the logo and the acronym, that stands for the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm a senior researcher there. One of the things that underpins all the work we do at INET is we come from a complexity or a systems perspective. And, systems thinking, complexity economics are kind of two quite closely related approaches in my mind. They all come from kind of complex systems ideas, dynamical systems ideas. And so I'm going to try and show the two sides of those two parts, one set of modeling from systems thinking and one from complexity economics, but they're both very heavily focused on the energy transition, which inspires a lot of our work at INET. So what I will do is first give a quick kind of sort of zoom out a bit and sort of say, okay, if we're working in quite applied contexts, what kind of models should we be using to inform decisions, and try and think about what do decision makers want from modeling. Then I'll walk through these two examples, one on systems mapping, one on agent-based modeling. So the systems mapping is systems thinking. Agent-based modeling is under this complexity economics umbrella. And then again, I'll come back to the kind of really practical world that I'm often living in, trying to apply these methods with individual decision-making, government, whether it's government departments or businesses, and sort of try and conclude with a few words about that. And then if there's questions coming through, we can take those at the end. So one of the things I want to kind of assert, or one of the arguments I've made in some of our recent papers, is that we need models, and here I say climate, energy, economy models. So it gives you a sense of some of the systems those models might cover. We need models that are fit for the decisions we make now, and the types of decisions we are facing now in the energy transition are quite different than the decisions we were looking at or thinking about 10 or 20 years ago. So I think we need to really bear in mind what decisions we've got to what we're facing, and use the right models for those decisions, not just use the models we've used for a long time. And I also think we need to have more variety in the types of models we use. And that's really a kind of just a basic, we need many models. It's better to bring many models to a problem rather than one. And I think particularly in the energy and environment and sort of climate space, it's quite well established, I think, now that some of the more traditional economic models, kind of neoclassical economic models, which are incredibly useful in certain contexts, in the context of the energy transition, do have a kind of systematic bias against more ambitious climate policy. That's been argued in lots of different places, and so we kind of strongly believe that we need more variety in the number and types of models we're using. So that's a kind of key thread through a lot of what I'm going to say.
So, question: are you referring to like the dynamic general equilibrium models or something else?
Yeah. So for me, particularly CGE models. And DSG models, these are equilibrium economic models, are ones that are quite clear in this space. And then I think the other thing to say is that there's a lot of integrated assessment models, which are very large models combining, maybe land use modules, economy modules, technology modules, climate system modules, and those models for their economy modules often use an equilibrium framing or a very aggregated model, and those are the types of models we're talking about here. They're fantastic models for other things, but I think when we're trying to think about the transformational change we're looking for in the energy transition, there's an issue there, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But I also don't want to dwell too much on just being rude about other models. We also want to sort of show the capabilities. I think it's very easy to be critical of other work, but you need to show the alternative and what that looks like.
Makes sense.
So yeah, just on the decisions, the types of decisions we're facing. In public policy, I think 20 years ago the question was, should we do something about climate change? How much should we do? Like, what will it cost? There were these types of questions. Whereas now I think if you go and speak to ministries around the world in national governments, which the type of people I mainly speak to with this work, they're really focused on a different type of question now. They know they need to do something. They have a mandate to do something, and they're really trying to design very specific sector-focused policies, and policies that will have economic benefits as well as delivering on the transition. And they really want to understand, what do those policies look like? What impacts might they have? So it's a different type of question there. And I think that's mirrored in business as well. So it's climate and energy is no longer seen as this kind of corporate social responsibility issue. It's now companies understanding they might be open to different types of risk, from the, whether it's transition risk or climate risk. And they really want to understand where their position is as the global economy is kind of rewired through the energy transition, and different sectors do well and other sectors maybe come down a bit or a lot. They want to understand their position in that and their exposure to that, and so they need to make really strategic decisions. So that there's the shift there is in business as well. And I think it's important to recognize that you look at the IRA in the US, that the policy is kind of very strategic and grand in that sense, and is moving ahead of analysis in one sense. If traditional economic analysis is trying to arguing about, let's just get the carbon price right, you can see that actually what politicians are doing, and in the EU as well, is moving beyond that. So I think we always need to keep pace with where the intuition of policymakers is going. So this is where I say a bit more about this piece about other types of modeling. So we know there's a definition there of equilibrium. That's, I think, hopefully, I'm assuming most people are familiar with that. Whereas in the case of meeting climate goals, we know we need transformational change, systems transitions. Again, that's fairly well, that's not really controversial to say that in any respect. The IPCC have been saying that for a long time. So we know there's a kind of mismatch there between models that are based on equilibrium and policy that needs to induce or support transformational change. And so the two sides of that debate there, you can kind of see in this, summarized in this table. We're trying to go from a more traditional position on marginal change. A lot of economics has been organized around this idea of marginal change. How do we do something at the margins, where policy maybe just makes a small impact on the economy, moving to the structural change position. So if we've used cost benefit analysis before, that's worked very well in certain contexts and is very appealing to governments. It gives this kind of sense of certainty and comparability between policies. But maybe we need to move from that, which works well in marginal change, to something a bit broader around kind of worst case, best case, dynamic analysis of the risks and opportunities. And we've started to talk about risk opportunity analysis, which is a kind of broader version of cost benefit analysis, but more dynamically literate. On kind of principles, we go from equilibrium principle to complex systems principle. And then in terms of the specific models, we go from optimizing models and equilibrium models to what I've called here simulating models. And what that word is a bit vague. I wish I had a better phrase for it. What we're trying to say here is models that actually give you a kind of likely future, or attempt to plot where we might actually get to, not define what the optimal solution or the optimal path would be. So the model becomes about what is likely to happen given some intervention or given what's happened already, not what is the optimal. It's a different type, it's a subtle difference, but really important in the way we model. And so one of the things we did in a recent paper was try to kind of bring together these ideas and sort of point to some of the models that are appearing in this space. The common themes we argue in this paper, in terms of what these models look like, you can kind of see listed here. They tend to be more granular than traditional models. They're more disaggregated. You see more individual level kind of modeling of actors and their dynamics. You see more regions. You see more breakdown by country level, that kind of disaggregation in that way. You see more disaggregation in terms of sectors. So we try and represent as many sectors as possible and really push for that granular detail. We also internally in the model, endogenously in the model, try to represent technological progress. A big story, a big part of the story on the energy transition is how different technologies are progressing, the costs, the deployment of technologies like solar and wind and batteries and electrolyzers. And what we're trying to do is have those dynamics of where the technologies are going and how they respond to policy and how they respond to deployment around the world endogenous in the model. And that's not often the case, or not always the case. Or there might be kind of quite simple models of technological progress. Another common theme in these models we found is that they represent policies in a real detail. So they don't just have a carbon price, but they actually represent a much larger number of levers, maybe mandates, things like that, where you can actually represent policies in more detail. And then, as I've already said, these models are dynamic models that represent systems out of equilibrium. It doesn't even really make sense to talk about equilibrium as an organizing principle in some of these models. And yeah, I'm quite pleased to say, of course I'm a bit biased, but there is now a quite mature cohort of these models that are out there. They've been around for a number of years. They've been applied to lots of different settings and starting to being used by decision makers. And so there's a link here to this project, the EAST project, the EEIST, where we try to present a kind of library of these models being used. So the nature energy piece is a kind of short overview. The EAST report that's linked to there is a kind of library of case studies of these models actually being used on specific questions in the energy transition. So if you want to see the gory detail, go to the report. If you want the big level picture, have a look at the comment in Nature Energy.
So then question, and you might get to this in a little bit, is these models, because they're a lot more flexible, are going to be much more data hungry. So how do you mitigate that, reduced accuracy because of the lack of data?
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. And it's basically true that they are definitely data hungry. And it sometimes might not even be that they are more data hungry than previous models, but they just want different data. Maybe they want this more disaggregated data. And that is a barrier to their adoption. But I think our position is you don't then stop and not use them. You maybe go through the iteration where you see what kind of value they can give you with the existing data, understand where the drawbacks are and where that creates too much uncertainty in their outputs or means that you don't like their assumptions because you haven't got the data to make better assumptions, and then go through a round of, well, we need to do more data collection, then we can have a version 2 of some of these models. So that's the ideal situation, I think. In practice, what we've tended to do is apply them to the places where we do have the data and where that's available. So, for example, one of the examples I'm going to show is in Brazil on the labor market. The reason that we worked on Brazil is because they have excellent administrative data on the labor market, which we were able to access. Whereas in India and China, where we've done a lot of work and tried to apply that model, we haven't been able to. In India, there's a large informal labor force, so it's really difficult to work out how to deal with that. There are some ways forward, but we haven't done those yet. And in China, I think that data is available, but for understandable reasons, the Chinese government doesn't want to give researchers at Oxford that data, that really disaggregated data. So we just haven't applied the model there. So that is a barrier. But I think with time, that can be resolved. But absolutely, I agree. And I also think there's a risk that the models are applied more often in the global north, where you're more likely to have these kind of detailed administrative data sets that you can use. And so there's a potential kind of issue there, I think. So you have to also think about, with some of the models, are there places you can apply them when you have less rich data available, and still do something useful. And I think we shouldn't, sometimes it's tempting to just go straight to the really good data and just do that, because that helps us churn out the papers and do the model just like we want. But maybe we systematically ignore places that we shouldn't be ignoring. Okay, just to say, before I dive into the 2 examples, just to say a little bit more about what are these models. This is one way we've tried to kind of communicate specifically what are these modeling approaches. And so you can see I've picked 2 extremes of the spectrum today. We've got systems mapping on the far left and agent-based modeling top right. But I think methods like system dynamics, which is a very mature method in its own right, fits into this kind of framework well. There's a whole bunch of disequilibrium macroeconomic models. The E3ME is a very well-known one. We've worked with colleagues who've developed that. There's also some technology models that are often combined with E3ME. That's the FTT model you see mentioned there just to the right of center. There's also work we've done at Oxford on experience curves or learning curves, trying to work out where technologies are going based on their path trends in terms of their costs and their deployment. We've also done work building on Ricardo Hausmann's and Cesar Hidalgo's work on economic complexity and thinking about trade patterns and what goods countries are, what products countries have comparative advantage in. So there's a whole bunch of different methods here which I think fit into this kind of this overarching framework that we've argued for. So yeah, I'm going to talk about systems mapping and ABM now. So systems mapping, if you've not bumped into this at all, I'll give a kind of 101 introduction and then show a few examples. And this is really, you know, at the very qualitative, very flexible end of the spectrum. This is systems thinking in that kind of participatory, inclusive mode, which I think is a really important complement to the more quantitative modeling we might do. So that's why I'm really keen to always show the two kind of together, systems mapping and ABM, because I think they give you different benefits in different contexts. So what is systems mapping? The first thing to say is there are lots of different types and definitions. People sometimes argue about that. I'm really not that interested in what is or what is not a systems mapping methodology. For me, the thing they hold in common is they're all trying to describe a system in some way. They're trying to model it. They're trying to think about the dynamics or the flows or the interrelationships in a system. And some of them are about stakeholders or about, material or financial flows or conceptual connections. The ones I'm going to talk about today and the ones I focus on in most of my work are methods that really focus on cause and influence. So we're trying to represent the causal structure, if you will, within a system. And normally we end up doing that through using networks. So networks of nodes and edges where the nodes are factors or variables, and then the edges, the arrows between them, are trying to assert some causal influence. Why should we, before I dive into the examples, why should we bother to do this? Why, this picture on the right is very popular. Why should we bother to put ourselves in a room and draw these kind of slightly simplified pictures of the world when we can see the reality is much more messy? And here's the kind of generic answer. Hopefully that helps us think. It disciplines our thinking. It orientates ourselves to different topics, especially when we do it with other people. It helps us synthesize and connect information so we can bring different types of data and evidence into a systems map. It's very flexible and inclusive in that sense. They should help us communicate. When you do a mapping workshop and you start to build up these diagrams, the conversations you have, I think, are far richer than if you were just talking around a topic. So you help to communicate within a group producing a systems map. But maybe also, if you're thoughtful about it, you can also communicate to other people who weren't involved in that initial process. But you do have to be careful, because one of my favorite phrases is horrendogram, right? These kind of spaghetti diagram, horrendogram things. You can produce those in these types of methods, and that's fine, but you have to take real care in how you then communicate that to other people. And lots of people don't necessarily want to look at a spaghetti diagram, but some of the kind of findings or lessons inside that map might be useful. So you have to think about how you communicate to other people. Hopefully these methods can also help us kind of extrapolate from some of our assumptions to implications. And so this starts to move us towards this more traditional idea of a model as somehow simulating something and making a forecast. Like, you can start to do that with some systems mapping methods. But the real benefit for me, when I know things are going well, is when the people I'm building these maps with are surprised and they have so-called aha moments. I've not thought of that. I'm surprised someone said that. And hopefully we should have those types of moments when we're building a map with different stakeholders. Okay, so let's look at 3 types quite quickly. So I would just, because there's a lot of different types of systems mapping, and I think often people just think of it as one kind of homogeneous set of things, but actually there are different types, and they give you very different types of values. So we have to be quite clear about that when we use them, I think. So the 3 levels I've put here, and this is not all, but this is 3 I think it's worth focusing on, is simple causal loops. So this is where we have relatively simple diagrams, not that many nodes and arrows, but we really focus around feedbacks and really try and describe what are the feedbacks that create maybe rapid change in this and reinforcing change in this system, and what are the feedbacks that maybe dampen the balance things out and kind of hold us in where we are already. And those kind of causal loop diagrams are really useful for generating narratives about dynamic systems. Then we might have a kind of a more medium level, what I would call a systems-based theory of change. So some people may have come across theory of change as a method, and really this is kind of taking theory of change and just putting a system spin on it. Here you tend to have maps that are slightly more detailed, but they're really disciplined in their thinking in terms of going from an intervention, the inputs and activities we might have in an intervention, through to its outputs and its outcomes. And so you're really trying to think about, if we're doing something in the world, whether we're a government or an NGO or a business, how does our activity and this intervention we're doing, how does it get us to the things we want? What are our causal assumptions? And try and really explain that and pin that down to discipline our thinking about that intervention design, evaluation of that intervention. And then lastly, this is the real hierogams, what I would call participatory system maps, where we have a much higher level of detail. We throw everything in, we build the map in a very inclusive way. The purpose here is slightly different. Instead of disciplining our thinking or generating narrative, here it's more about building ownership, building consensus, building kind of capacity within a group of stakeholders to make decisions or take ownership of their system, or just think about their system in a different way. So let me show a couple of examples of these. This is a causal loop diagram. You can see already here it's organized around the feedbacks. They're kind of shown with the way the arrows are curved to give you these circles. You know, we have social action here labeled, we have organizational legitimacy. You can also see they're labeled with balance, with B1 and R1. That's for a balancing loop. This is one that holds us in place. And R1, that's a reinforcing loop. That's one that maybe you might create exponential change. So you see these maps organized around these kind of principles. One thing I should say is causal loop diagrams are often a first step towards building a system dynamics simulation, a quantitative system dynamics model. And at some points in time, you know, I think that was kind of the only place you saw them, maybe. But now I think, particularly in the UK, of course, I'm UK centric in my thinking, you see a lot of people using causal loop diagrams in their own right and not turning them into a system dynamics model, but using the causal loop model as the main output. And so I think it's important to recognize that as a kind of practice in its own right. Here's one example, another example we produced with policymakers in China. I'll walk you through the logic here. You can see here 2 loops described, one a reinforcing loop and one a balancing loop. This is around the emissions trading scheme in China. So this is, you know, key policy potentially in the energy transition. China has a emissions trading scheme, relatively new, I think intentionally relatively weak at the moment in the way it's been implemented. And the question now is, like, is that going to be ramped up and strengthened through time? And what we were trying to do here was think, how might the emissions trading scheme affect the dynamic system of the deployment or the decarbonization of the power sector in China? And so the reinforcing loop is the first place I want to start. Here you can see we have deployment. Hopefully you can see my arrow. You can see at the center, slightly towards the bottom, we have this clean technology deployment. As we get more deployment, we get more innovation in clean technology. We maybe get more competitiveness in the sector. And then hopefully, if we follows historical precedent, you start to see the costs of clean technology come down. Once the costs come down relative to fossil fuel, carbon technologies, then maybe you get more deployment. And so you get this reinforcing loop. As deployment goes up, we get better at making these technologies, wind, solar, batteries. The cost comes down further, therefore we get more deployment. This is this reinforcing, learning by doing feedback loop. Hopefully,
and this is basically the synthesis of the stakeholders' opinions about what pushes what.
Absolutely, and I think yes, and I mean also I think that loop is also talked about in the literature a huge amount. So it's also a kind of, I think, a reasonably well established kind of empirical fact that you do see these learning by doing effects, and that's there. And over on the left hand side here you see supply of permits. That kind of represents the emissions trading scheme, and so the supply of permits creates a permit price that increases the cost of carbon technologies, which then affects this relative cost, which then increases deployment. So in one sense, the emissions trader scheme is just providing a nice boost to this reinforcing loop. We're already seeing the reinforcing loop, and then the ETS comes in. It makes fossil technologies a bit more expensive again, and we boost that reinforcing loop. So that's a good story, and similar to if there was a carbon tax, a similar dynamic would be there. However, we also felt, and the stakeholders we built the map with also felt, there might be a balancing loop that's introduced by the emissions trading scheme. So here, if I walk you through again, starting at deployment, okay, we get some deployment of clean technologies. We reduce some of the emissions. That's the red arrow, means we then reduce some of the emissions. That's great. That's exactly what we want. That's why it's an outcome in kind of a teal color. But then maybe that reduction in emissions reduces the demand for permits, and then maybe that reduction in demand for permits reduces the permit price in the ETS scheme, and then maybe that starts to put a downward pressure on the total cost of carbon technologies. And so you can start to kind of hypothesize, as we get some progress, the ETS and actually almost dampens that by this kind of downward pressure on demand for permits and permit prices. Now, of course, in reality, or at least in the EU emissions trading scheme, a floor price has been introduced. There's a very complicated set of mechanisms to manage the supply of permits. And a big part of what that floor price for permits and the management of supply, a big part of what that is about is trying to mitigate or disrupt this, or just avoid completely this balancing loop. And so this balancing loop, I think, arguably is there. It's more debatable, I think, but it's also something that we can see in practice people have been trying to manage. And so what we're trying to describe here with this map is explain some of the dynamics that might be in this system, and then think about how we might manage them. And we also made a similar diagram for the carbon tax, which we argued does not introduce that balancing loop, because a carbon tax doesn't have this system of permits, but maybe a carbon tax is undesirable for other reasons. So yeah, this is just trying to, you can hopefully see here, the reason I've kind of labored this point is you start to see how we're using the map to communicate and develop kind of dynamic thinking about the system. In this particular piece of work, we then built an agent-based model of the power sector with agents as our companies and our power plants in China. And we really tried to make sure that we represented both of these dynamics in our model. So we were putting that dynamic thinking very explicitly into our quantitative model. Theory of change, I'll go a bit quicker on the next two. Theory of change, this again, here's an example, not from my work, this is from work elsewhere, where we're going from at the top, the activities of a particular policy intervention, and then trying to think through how that creates the impacts we want. Here's one example, reasonably linear, but I quite like this example. It's quite detailed, I think, but it's trying to think, how are we affecting the world? Trying to think through the logic of the intervention. We could have a systems version of that, which is basically, in the end, I think, just a bigger, messier version of a theory of change, maybe with more feedbacks, more topics coming in. And so this is a map we built with the UK government, and they use this directly in an evaluation. So this is a map of renewable heating policy in the UK, and they'd spent a lot of money trying to incentivize and subsidize renewable heating investments. And so they used this to inform their evaluation. So the policy was up and running. They knew they needed to interview a lot of people, look at some of the data on the scheme, try and understand, make an assessment of whether this policy had worked well, whether this was money well spent. They used this systems theory of change to really try and kind of sense check and scope out what other things we should be looking for when we're evaluating this policy. What are all the aspects and characteristics of this policy and how it's interacted with the sector it was aimed at. And so it's just a way of, it's just a kind of general purpose resource in some sense to inform the focus and scope of that evaluation. So that's how we've used systems theory of change.
So now, how, I guess more concretely, you can, I guess this can be as loose as you want, but when you're spending a lot of money, you want to make sure that you put some kind of number. Standard like treatment effect estimation says that for every dollar spent, this is so many benefits. Whereas this seems a lot more complicated, but a lot looser. So I guess how does a stakeholder overcome that imprecision of something this high level?
Yeah. Well, I think you do both. You should still do the economic valuation. But as part of your evaluation, you should also have an element where you say, let's think about all the elements that might have influenced our outcomes, all the other things in the system that might have influenced our outcomes or might have affected our influence on those outcomes, and try and picture that. And then when we do the parts of the evaluation that are talking to people, just interviewing people and running focus groups with what we might call the beneficiaries of a policy, and saying, how did this work for you? What were your opinions of how this policy was working? We can ask them as many of the right types of questions as possible. So it's a complement to the more narrow economic valuation we might do, where you try and really focus on specific indicators and see how they've changed in relation to how much money you've spent, say. So I think you need both. If you've got enough time and money, you should do both of those things in an evaluation.
Okay, and this actually looks a lot like because it's very much a causal diagram. If you want to do treatment effect estimation, this points you to the confounders you have to account for.
Yes, yeah, you could absolutely use it in that type of way to kind of as a brainstorm way to look for confounders and things like that. Absolutely, and think through which of these elements do we have data for? What could we feasibly collect? What is maybe impossible or very difficult to collect? Where are our blind spots? Yeah, where do we have more certainty or less?
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
And then the last one, here's the real spaghetti horrendograms. These are maps we built with a large group of stakeholders in the northwest of England, looking at how a river was interacting with its local environment and the local economy, kind of really thinking about water, environment, and economic interactions. And here, although I don't want to dwell on this for long, but the point here is we make the big messy diagram, and there's a lot of value in the process, and the people we make that diagram with get to feel like they've been listened to. They get to bring together their different worldviews into one model. So there's a value in the process, but it's very hard to then have value in the outputs. And so what we've tried to develop is methods to extract useful things from that big messy diagram. And so on the right hand side, you see a couple of examples. Still, the top right one is still a bit messy, but the bottom right, you start to be a kind of clearer picture, I think. We're trying to extract stories or kind of subsections of this bigger picture. So the top right one is a policy at the top, a very contentious policy around agricultural subsidies, and then trying to say what's the impacts of that policy change. And the bottom right, we pulled out two outcomes we really care about, habitat and biodiversity, and tried to say, well, what are the things that are immediately driving or affecting those factors, those outcomes we care about, according to our stakeholders. So those are just two examples of how you might pull out something smaller and then work with that. You might also try and pull out a theory of change from a big messy diagram. But the point for me is we can build big diagrams and then try and do something with them. It doesn't have to be just that the value is only in the process. Okay, so those are 3 examples of systems mapping. I've tried to argue that there's a variety in the methods. Here's a couple of ways to think about how they're different from each other. Some are more focused on the system as a whole, some are more focused on interventions. I've talked about 3 more qualitative methods today, but there are more quantitative versions, or where you bring in some numbers to these maps. Some of these maps are there's more emphasis on participation and wider kind of diverse groups of people building them. Some methods are kind of more neutral on participation. None are anti-participation. And then, you know, there is a difference. I think we have to be honest in how intuitive or easy some of these methods are used. I think basically the methods with more, when you start to bring in numbers and quantify things, the methods where you try and do more analysis on your big messy diagram, they may be more difficult to use. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll move on to the agent-based model example. So far we've done a lot of work. I've basically spent the last kind of 10 years or so building these types of maps in lots of different contexts and trying to use them, and sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, definitely changing my practice as I've gone. It's always been about participation though, and building them with people in workshops. And I think one of the really interesting future directions is thinking about how might we start to use text data or quantitative data that we have on these systems to build maps and supplement the maps we build with stakeholders. And, you know, my dream in kind of 10, and I don't know how many years to say this, but in 5 or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, is that if you're a policymaker sat in government, you could start running a participatory process, you could start running a bunch of workshops, but in parallel, you might be able to say, we know there's a lot of literature on this topic, or there's been a lot of reports written about this topic. Let's pour those into a natural language processing algorithm, or use a large language model to extract some causal statements from that literature and build a systems map very quickly that way. Or maybe we have some time series data on some of the key indicators or key variables in this system. Let's use some of the, you know, there's a plethora of different methods, more quantitative statistical methods, to try and estimate the relationships between things when we have time series data. So my kind of vision is that in the future, we will have those methods to hand so we can very quickly generate maps that way, and then synthesize or combine those with maps we build in a more traditional kind of stakeholder informed way. So that's one of the directions I'm trying to push on at the moment, as well as just applying these methods over and over again and learning and getting better at them. Okay, so let's completely kind of shift and talk about agent-based modeling. This is then, we've done the systems thinking qual piece. This is now the complexity economics quantitative piece, but still with lots of the same ideas underneath. This is a kind of a much larger endeavor in some respects. This particular piece of work, you can see the number of people involved there. We've got colleagues from Oxford, the World Bank, and also the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. And what we're trying to do here is model the labor market and use an agent-based model to model the labor market, and I think offer a reasonably unique capability in terms of a granular representation of the labor market. So this was our kind of homework question, as it were, trying to think about how unemployment at this occupation level, and I'll talk a bit more about why occupations in a moment, but at this occupation level, how unemployment might be affected by different paths, growth paths that Brazil could maybe follow. So we're thinking, what does the future look like in Brazil in terms of it trying to achieve sustainable development, in terms of trying to deliver the energy transition? What might that mean for unemployment? What might that mean for specific occupations? And that type of question of, what does the transition mean for jobs? So just to put it very bluntly, that question is kind of relevant everywhere. Governments all around the world are interested in this question of what is this going to mean for jobs? And this model is trying to get at that. So we know we have these different transition policies or pathways we might follow. And we know that the reason people are interested in it is because I think we know that they are going to have some impact on labor demand. Some jobs are going to be in more demand, some jobs are going to be in less demand. But we also know that the labor market has frictions, there's variation in labor supply. And so we're going to get kind of heterogeneous employment outcomes. And, you know, it might be that overall we say there's more jobs and there's better jobs, great. But there might be in particular regions or particular sectors or particular occupations that really suffer in the transition. And that's really important. You know, in previous transitions, I know in the UK, for example, you look at how the transition away from coal to gas had huge socioeconomic upheaval. Even if you looked at the total number of jobs, it might have seemed kind of okay. But you looked at specific regions and occupations being affected, and that dominated the narrative, that dominated political thinking. And I don't really care whether that was right or wrong, but it is important. And so we need to understand, I think, in this disaggregated detail, where where the benefits and where the pain, as it were, might be falling in the labor market. So to look at the labor market, we build two things really. One, an occupational mobility network, nice long name, but it's basically a network diagram which tries to show with the nodes our occupations and show where people move between them. I'll show that in a moment. The second thing we build is on top of that, we build an agent-based model where we have individual agents, our workers, moving around that occupation mobility network. And then, of course, we need some kind of change or transition scenario to kind of prod this labor market. And in this particular piece of work, we took two scenarios from work by the World Bank, where they kind of defined two potential scenarios for Brazil moving forward. And that was our kind of shock, our labor market shock, as it were, that we then exposed the agent-based model to. And I'll talk, as I go, I'll talk more about those. Just one piece of context on Brazil that's important to understand, I think, for our scenarios. Brazil is quite unusual in some ways, and that most of its emissions, and you can see here CO2 equivalent tons, most of them come from agriculture and land use. And it has a much smaller amount of emissions from energy compared to other countries. And you see the purple here is the agriculture and land use and forestry, deforestation emissions, and the orange is energy. So it's a slightly unusual example in that sense. In terms of our scenarios, we focused on two scenarios. One of them was around agriculture and one of them was around manufacturing. And these scenarios, the team in Oxford don't really, we didn't design these scenarios. Don't make any comment on whether they're the right or interesting scenarios to look at. They're just scenarios for us to put into our model of the labor market and see what these scenarios might mean for the labor market. These were the scenarios developed by Ferreira, Filo, and Hanush from the World Bank. So one of them, the one around agriculture, basically assumes that there's a slow, or I don't know if it's fast or slow if I'm honest, but an increase in the productivity, the total factor productivity, that's the TFP, nice economic jargon, but the productivity in the agricultural sector increases 0.5% per year. So this is a kind of investment in agriculture. This is Brazil following agriculture for its development and pushing hard on that. And in their modeling, they used a CGE model. They say, oh, there's higher GDP, there's a little bit less deforestation, but maybe there's more emissions overall in that scenario. That's from the World Bank. They then had a manufacturing scenario where they looked at productivity increases in manufacturing. So this is Brazil pushing more on its manufacturing sector and trying to increase productivity there. And they have the similar, or slightly different, but same dimensions, the results on GDP being a bit higher, deforestation, and they actually found there's lower emissions. So for, again, World Bank's work, I'm not here to defend or support that this is right or wrong, but this, in their modeling, they found that manufacturing scenario where we had higher productivity gave us higher GDP and lower emissions. So that they seem to favor that scenario in that sense. And we basically were taking these and plugging them into our labor market model. How do we do that? We need to know for each occupation, what is the labor demand? And so we can take from the World Bank's CGE model, we can take by sector, what are the changes in labor demand, crosswalk that to our occupations, and then we get, you know, this network of, and you can see here the network of occupations. We are then able to, you know, boost the demand for some occupations and drop them for others. So we're able to introduce that shock. And this diagram, it's messy and big, but I think it's nice. This is, you know, each node in this network is an occupation. The connections between them are if there historically has been a transition of workers going from that occupation to another. So we're representing here the fact that the labor market is constrained. You can't move from one occupation to any occupation. You can only move, the agents in our model can only move to the occupations where people have historically moved. And that probability is kind of weighted by how many people have made that movement in the past. And really here is one of the places where the data is vital. So we are only able to build this network because we have historical data on labor market transitions, because they have this race data set in Brazil. This is collected by the government. Anyone who's enrolled and, you know, pays tax is tracked, and so we can capture these movements. So this is one of the places where the model is possible because we have really rich data.
So I'm aware, I mean, US has similar data from the Department of Labor Statistics, and I'm sure many OECD economies have the same. To what extent can you extrapolate such matrices from the heavy data collection countries to, well, India, for example, which is not dissimilar, I think is what I can say.
Yeah. Fantastic question. Yeah, we've kind of thought about this a bit. It really is a question of how similar you think those economies are, and how similar all of the social and economic behaviors and contexts are, how similar they are, so that you think those transitions would be similar. So we've thought a bit about what's the difference between the UK and the US. I think in the US you have a much more mobile labor force, whereas in the UK people are much more used to staying in the area they're from or where they're currently living, and people tend to move less. It's more of an upheaval in some sense, culturally or socially. So we haven't used the US data for the UK. Similar for the US data to India, I think would be maybe even more of a jump, because India has a large informal sector, a labor sector, and so the way people move around that is just, I think, will be qualitatively different. And so even if we can make a guess that the occupations are similar, then the nodes are the same, the network would look very different. But that's a huge question. You could just use the network from one country and apply it to another if you don't have the data there. Or you could, yeah, for the countries you have several, you could kind of look for commonalities and then try and infer some sort of generic transition probability between nodes. Some of my colleagues are pushing on that a bit. Another way you can think about it is looking at the descriptions of these jobs and thinking about what skills they have in common, and try and then allow connections between occupations where the skills or the descriptions of those jobs are similar. So again, going back to NLP, the natural language processing, we have thought a bit about using that to try and capture like similarity between occupations in terms of their skills or description. So there's other ways, of course, you can try and capture this intrinsic relation between different occupations.
Right. And so are there aggregate metrics that you can like match, like total number of employees moving from region to region, maybe not employment, you know, occupation by occupation, you can match moments of those distributions, that kind of thing?
You could, yeah, we haven't done that, but you could try to do that. For the Brazil example, we actually started to break down this first version of the model that I'm showing now. We did with no regions, but the second version, which is nearly ready to be put out in a working paper and hopefully submitted to a journal pretty soon, we do have regions. So for each occupation, we have that occupation in the different states of Brazil. I think there's around 20 or so. And so there you do have regional movements as well as occupational movements. So you start to disentangle, you start to try and present both. But yeah, I guess if you this is where this question of like what to do when you don't have the data, there are ways around it. The assumptions start to become bigger and more questionable, but you can kind of progress if you want to. We've also talked a lot with colleagues in India about applying it there, where there's particular pilots being run, and we understand a local labor market in a lot of detail. And we do have data on a local labor market, even though we don't have the national level or a state level picture, and using that to then infer the network. So there's kind of ways around it in that sense, but we haven't done a lot of that.
Makes sense, yeah.
Then I'm conscious of time, so I'll try and bring us to a close. Then on top of that network, we have our agents moving around. Our agents have a very simple set of rules. They can be employed in some occupation with some probability. They are separated from that, i.e., you know, where for whatever reason they no longer have that job. There are then vacancies within an occupation they can apply for, and they will only apply for jobs that are connected in that network, basically. So they will only apply for jobs in their occupation or neighboring occupations. And as I said before, we have that labor demand from the pre-World Bank modeling, and we use that to push up and down the demand for our different occupations. What does that give you in terms of an output? We've got our agents moving around this network. What it allows you to do basically is make quite disaggregated forecasts about where we might feel the pain or the benefit of that transition. And so here's one way we've tried to communicate the results of the model. There's a lot going on in these plots. This is the agriculture scenario and the manufacturing scenario on the left and right. On the x-axis, we have kind of change in demand for these occupations. Each bubble, each dot on the map is an occupation. And then on the y-axis, you have the change in unemployment. So an increase in unemployment, a bad, thing we don't want, that's above the dotted line, above here. And the decrease in unemployment is below the dotted line. So you start to say, this occupation is doing really well, or this occupation is doing bad. And you start to see the network effect. So you can see here on the left-hand panel, construction site foreman experiencing an increase in unemployment, even though they have quite a big increase in demand, and even though masons have a similar increase in demand, but has a very different experience, and that comes just from their network position. Construction site foremen are much better connected in the network, so even though they have a lot of demand, there's a lot of people moving into that occupation, resulting in there still being unemployment at the occupation level. The other thing you can see in these plots is the wage. So we're trying to look for, is there a pattern by wage? That's done by color. I don't think there's a big impact of wages here that's obvious. The other thing you can see is the blue squares, the squared dots, the squares on the diagram. Those are the outcomes for occupations if we had a full density network. So if any occupation can move to anywhere, then we get a result with the blue squares being the occupations. And so here what we're trying to show is the impact of the network. So you can start to see how occupations, because we're representing this transition probability between occupations, we're getting a different result than if we just assumed there was a completely frictionless, anyone could move anywhere. The thing I'm really excited about with this work is then using this with policymakers, and they can start to say, okay, which occupations should we be trying to support? Where are the occupations where we need to do reskilling, where we need to do support, because we know there are people who might be feeling pain in different energy transition scenarios. So it really helps us to target the support for people who might need it in the transition. And I think that will hopefully reduce political pushback. It will reduce the potential for the transition to be slowed by these types of issues. Okay, I will bring things to a close in the next minute or so. So I said I'd say something about using these methods in policy. This is one way of thinking about the policy cycle, from agenda setting through to policy design and formulation, through to all the way around to evaluation, which I've mentioned before. For me, we have to be really clear when we're using these methods. We have to be quite savvy in how we think about the policy cycle, and we need to know where we are in the policy cycle and how we're trying to use these methods. And I've got a few annotations here of where I think that can be done. But the overarching point is we just really need to think about where we are in the policy cycle and how we're delivering value for decision makers. A big issue for me, I think, is that we need to have bits of modeling follow a policy around. What happens a lot, at least in the UK, and I think probably elsewhere, is we do a piece of modeling early in the cycle, before a policy has been fully designed. We do it, we use that information, and then it gets kind of discarded and never looked at again. What we need is to build those theories of change, to build the simulations that we run ex ante before the policy has been introduced, and then use those again in the evaluation, use those models again. So I would love for both systems mapping and ABM to follow policies around more often and be used at different stages in the cycle. There's lots of challenges. Here's a few. There's conceptual challenges around these methods. There's the data ones that's already come up. I think there's also just kind of really pragmatic kind of institutional challenges. People are unsure about using new methods if they're not established. I'm always asked, who else has used these methods? What's the risk if we do this? And so we need to have good answers to that when we use these methods. And I think we do, but we have to be aware of some of these issues. And yeah, how to start. I'm often asked kind of, okay, how do I begin? For me, I think we need to start thinking, as this is something we ramp up. You don't immediately dive in and do a big, very quantitative agent-based model if you've never done anything like that before in a particular applied context. You need to ramp up, build the capacity. And so I think systems mapping is an excellent entry point. But then from there, we need to start to build capacity and expertise with the decision makers, with the analysts working in government, and go from there, rather than just try and dump very complex pieces of modeling on decision making or government bodies that don't have the capacity to actually use that in an intelligent way. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening. There's the two links I mentioned at the beginning, the nature energy piece, which kind of gives the big picture on this, and the library of examples from the EAST project. Thanks a lot, Greg.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you very much. If perhaps there's one last question, especially with this audience, is to what extent, I mean, you mentioned like using large language models to process text and that kind of stuff, but using LLMs or just big compute with agent-based models or new data sets, to what extent can they support these much more compute and data intensive models?
I think there's huge potential for them to support and augment the agent, but both the methods. On the agent-based modeling, which I said less about, there's a bunch of different things you can do. So historically, one area where I've seen activity, historically, you might be calibrating your model and you might say, oh, I'm not sure what the value of this parameter should be. So I change the value, I see how it affects my result. I kind of do a sensitivity analysis, just changing parameters. What you're starting to see people do now is using AI methods to actually not just change a parameter in their model, but change the agent's behavior and systematically change the agent rules and see how that affects the model outcomes and kind of calibrate the agent rules to the outcome we're looking for. And so you're kind of increasing the sophistication of that calibration process a huge amount. And you can only do that quick enough because you have AI tools to help you play around with the agent rules rather than just individual parameters. So that's one example I've seen of that being done. But I think there's a huge number of ways you can do that. And some of my colleagues have written about that. But to be honest with you, I've not done a huge amount of that. I've focused much more at applying it with policymakers.
So that's an interesting one. To what extent is it the benefit and flaw of equilibrium models? They assume is agents are rational and they kind of can foresee the future and react with respect to that. And what you're starting to describe is an agent-based model that has that same flavor. We don't have to know how agents are going to behave. You have them learn what the rational thing to be doing is. Of course, they can, they can game this thing. So I'm not sure to what extent this is feasible.
Yeah, could do. I think the other way to think about it is in an agent-based model, you can represent bounded rationality, which I think is a much more plausible representation of behavior. So your agents are not all seeing, all knowing, but they do maybe working in an optimizing way. They're trying to maximize their utility, but they do that with limited availability of information, or they might also have kind of rules of thumb or heuristics that they use to make decisions. And we can represent those really easily in an agent-based model. And we can also represent the variety in those. So we don't have to have one representative agent. We can have lots of different decision rules amongst the population of agents. And so, yeah, the ABM, a kind of 101 value is that we can represent that variety. And then maybe using AI, we can really get more sophisticated about how we tune or calibrate those decision rules to make the model perform well, to make it reproduce the patterns we see in the real world. And that performance testing or validation of ABMs is something we really push hard on at INET and try and hold ourselves to a high standard.
So in this case, tuning population of agents to minimize models' predictive error, but it's kind of a gradient-free optimization kind of a process.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. You're trying to minimize that difference between your model outputs and some real data you have from the past. So you're trying to reproduce a pattern you've seen in the past and minimize that error given whatever method. And there's a long list of different ways to do that. Experimenting with either changing parameters or agent rules.
All right, well, fantastic. Thank you very much. This is excellent.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Greg. Pleasure.
Yeah, have a good rest of your day. Bye.